Mercedes reveals their failed experiment. McLaren's rear wing has caught the attention of rivals, and CALOPINTO could be set for a seat next season. Do consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's get straight into the latest F1 news. Lewis Hamilton says he had to yank the steering wheel to overcome crippling balance issues with his Mercedes in Formula One's Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Hamilton qualified 7th on Saturday after a difficult qualifying session, explaining Mercedes had found one of its car components was not correctly built and led him up the wrong setup direction. His lowly qualifying position prompted Mercedes' decision to fit him with a new power unit for the race. Following a suspension setup change, Hamilton started from the pit lane and managed to climb to 9th at the finish, but only after a late clash between Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz and a late move on Haas's Nico Hülkenberg. Despite the comeback, the 7-time world champion endured a frustrating afternoon in which he was seen fighting the Mercedes to get around the Baku street circuit's tight 90-degree bends. On the team radio, Hamilton mentioned his unorthodox driving style, saying, "Do you see how I'm driving this thing?" It was a reference to his huge handling issues, which appeared despite only making small car changes after a more positive Friday. "It was probably the worst balance I have ever had," Hamilton said. "I had so much front end and no rear. I had to yank the steering to break the traction at the front and slide it through every corner. It was the weirdest way to drive. I knew we would not be able to overtake today. It is one of those tracks. I don't know why our pace was so bad from our side from Saturday." After losing an engine in Australia, Hamilton was due an engine penalty at some stage this season, and Mercedes chief Toto Wolff explains that the team decided to take it in Baku because it is even more difficult to pass in Singapore, and the team has high hopes for the following round in Austin. "We decided to do the engine change here, and we knew that it was going to be a race of misery because it's so difficult to overtake in Baku," Wolff said. And that's what it was. The moment you come closer, you overheat the tires and then you go backwards. There were two different philosophies and we discussed it at length. You just swallow the pill here because starting from P7 we didn't know where that would have gone, or you do it in Austin. But we feel that Austin is an opportunity, so that was the decision. Right or wrong, I don't know. It was a close call. Mercedes is pinning its Austin hopes on a new floor it is planning to introduce, although its decision to revert to an older floor model in Azerbaijan hasn't produced conclusive results just yet. The track is an outlier, but nevertheless, it's not like this was night and day. We still suffered from the same balance performance that we had on the new floor. So in Singapore, we have the same one that's going to shift over, and we need to race that. But from Austin onwards, we'll probably go to a new specification. Mercedes' puzzling knife-edge performance window was also highlighted by George Russell, who struggled in the first stint on mediums but delivered a much more competitive hard tire stint that saw him earn a podium. "A difficult drive at the beginning. I think it's tricky when you're in a train and you're fighting for position, but clearly our car is not good enough," Wolff explained. "The balance was not good enough to be really able to keep up, and we suffered from that. And the second stint was truly amazing. Difficult at the beginning, but once the car found its balance, because George drove it in the way it must be driven, then we were at times the quickest car." He added, "As a matter of fact, this is about who is getting the balance as good as possible, who is having the tires in the right window, and what kind of aero concept works well at a given track." A new technical intrigue has arisen in the aftermath of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, with McLaren's rear wing under the spotlight. Footage from the rear-facing onboard camera on Oscar Piastri's MCL38 showed the upper flap distorting under load, with the most visible aspect of this being the outer leading edge of the upper flap, which tilts upwards as speed builds. This could potentially give rise to a further reduction in drag and boost its straight-line speed, and will once again bring the topic of FLEXI-WINGs to the fore. So far, the questions that have been raised this season have been in regard to the legality of some of the front wing solutions on display. However, there's clearly going to be a renewed interest in rear wing deflection and flexible elements for the rest of this season. The intrigue about the McLaren rear wing design comes after a race where Piastri was able to hold off Leclerc, despite his rival having the DRS open advantage. FLEXI wings have long been a source of irritation in Formula One. After all, the teams are constantly seeking means to exploit aeroelasticity to improve the performance of their machines, while staying within the bounds of the static tests that the FIA employ to reduce their impact. Of course, these components will always deform differently once load is applied on track, as it exceeds the values of the tests, which are more about establishing a baseline to prevent designs that could be considered unsafe. However, this has led to the use of other tactics to help police matters, with the monitoring of onboard camera footage providing a means to establish how the deformation of components is occurring, which can, in turn, be used to alter the regulations and prevent matters further spiraling out of control. This method was introduced in 2021, with the governing body requesting that all teams install 12 target dots in specific locations on the main plane and upper flap. This was in order that the dots could be used as a reference when the footage from the rear-facing camera is reviewed. These dots can be seen in the main image, 6 black dots on the upper flap and 6 white dots on the main plane. It's understood that this had largely acted as a means to self-police the over-rotation of the rear wing assemblies, and in the wake of accusations regarding flexible front wings this season, a similar tactic has been employed during Friday's practice sessions since the Belgian Grand Prix. Given that the FIA will have seen the upper flap's leading edge rotating rearwards from the onboard footage, red arrow inset, as it has been doing so for a number of races already this season, it would suggest the ruling body is happy that it's within the constraints currently posed by the regulations. In terms of the net effect of this flexion, it's likely that the gap being between the upper flap and main plane has a similar effect to DRS when it is deployed, albeit having nowhere near the same potency. But, given this occurs as load builds on the assembly, it can be expected to offer a performance boost across the entirety of the lap. For example, the flap flexion could also be witnessed in the middle sector in Azerbaijan, with the onboard footage showing the flap visibly lifting in the outer portion, as the upper flap pulled up clear of the tip section alongside, albeit not with the same force as it was on the main straight. This mini DRS, as it's being dubbed, is another example of the ingenuity shown by Formula One's engineers, as they have found a way to interpret the regulations in a way that their rivals haven't, and gained an edge over them as a consequence. The more interesting battle is yet to come, though, as the rest of the teams will now undoubtedly look at how they can incorporate a similar design methodology, albeit it's likely that McLaren has taken full advantage of it already this season, given we've already visited a large proportion of the high-speed events on the calendar. Formula One fans were treated to an unfamiliar sight in Baku, as Max Verstappen was out-qualified by Red Bull teammate Sergio Perez for the first time in 33 races, before being well beaten in the race. How did the World Champions weekend go so wrong? It was particularly odd that the Azerbaijan Grand Prix ended up being Perez's best race in 18 months, and that the Mexican was genuinely in contention for the win, when his otherwise dominant teammate Verstappen struggled. Baku came off the back of a bruising period for Red Bull as car balance issues introduced in May caused a slide F1's formerly dominant team struggled to arrest, with Verstappen now winless for 7 races while McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes all grabbed victories. Having driven a monster in Monza, Baku offered glimpses that Red Bull had understood the crippling handling issues that initially derailed Perez's campaign and then started affecting Verstappen. Perez had been on the back foot after Friday practice at most weekends this season, struggling to find solutions to turn the car setup around to suit his style. But aided by a tweaked floor design, in Baku the Mexican was much happier, and that confidence extended to qualifying where he claimed 4th, outperforming Verstappen for the first time since the 2023 Miami Grand Prix. But while Perez found a solid setup, Verstappen's side of the garage went in a different direction, and according to the Dutchman had tipped it over the edge of what was drivable. As soon as I went out in Q1, I just felt the car took a step back, Verstappen explained on Saturday. We made some changes and the car just became incredibly unpredictable and difficult. That caused a lot of bouncing in the back of the car when turning in and out of a corner. I had too much oversteer, and you don't want that on a street circuit. Because of F1's park firm rules, Verstappen was largely stuck with what he had, with the suspension setup in particular being frozen, as any changes would have meant a pit lane start. It didn't take long for Verstappen's issues to resurface during the race. He craftily passed Mercedes' George Russell at the start for 5th, but then struggled to keep up with the pace of Ferrari man Carlos Sainz in front, complaining over the team radio that the car had 0 bite and struggled to navigate Baku's tight 90-degree corners. Following his only pit stop, he was then unable to pass hard tire starter Lando Norris, being overtaken by Russell instead. After Norris's later stop, the Briton clawed back a pit stop worth of race time to easily repass Verstappen for what turned out to be 4th place. I think we just paid the price with the change that we made into qualifying, Verstappen explained. That made it just really difficult to drive. The car was jumping around a lot. The wheels were coming off the ground in the low-speed corners, so when you don't have a contact patch with the tarmac, it's very difficult. You win and lose as a team. We thought it would be a good direction to go into, and at the end it wasn't. Verstappen pointed out the new floor design did improve his car behavior before the wrong setup change, so the weekend wasn't an unmitigated disaster in the wider context of the season and Red Bull's long-term performance. The car did feel a bit better than what we had before. The overall behavior is better. It's just that you always try to make changes to make the car even better, but unfortunately what we did made it worse, he said. I had the connection with the car, but then unfortunately with the change we made, we lost it again. But the race showed that with Checo, when he was a bit happier, the car was performing a bit better. We are in that fight. Team principal Christian Horner suggested Verstappen's setup choice had a negative impact on his tire wear, especially when he was stuck behind hard tire starters Alex Albon and Norris. Checo's car was very quick. I think we might have introduced something to Max's car that didn't work as well and probably damaged the tires quite a lot fighting in that group for such a long period of time, Horner told Sky Sports F1. If you look at Russell's stint, he started very, very slowly and then just builds into it and has a better tire at the end. So yes, really very, very frustrating. There'll be a big post-mortem to see what the variances between the two cars are, which are obviously reasonably subtle. But he was not as comfortable as Checo was, so obviously we need to get into that to understand why. Given that teammate Oscar Piastri won the race, Baku may still feel like a bigger opportunity missed for Norris than it was for Verstappen. But every point is going to count, especially as F1 heads to Red Bull's Achilles heel in Singapore this week, which will likely be another round of damage limitation. But despite Norris beating him to 4th from 15th on the grid, Verstappen said he wasn't too upset by conceding 3 points to the McLaren driver, given the calamitous car behavior he dealt with. It's probably positive for me, he added as the gap came down to 59 points with 7 races remaining. I would have liked to extend the gap, but with our race, I'm so happy that it was only that. What can I do for Singapore? Well, we're trying to optimize the setup to understand what we did wrong here. I don't think it's going to be our best track, naturally, but we'll see. It might surprise us. It's never nice to see McLaren leading the constructors' standings, but the fight is not over yet. We'll try to get that back. In a matter of weeks, Franco Colapinto has cemented himself as someone to watch in F1. The 21-year-old scored points in just his Grand Prix last weekend, taking a brilliant 8th in Baku after an equally impressive qualifying. With both Williams seats for 2025 already filled, team principal James Vowles will support Colapinto in contract negotiations elsewhere in the paddock. As recently reported by LWS, Sauber are understood to be interested in Franco Colapinto's services. His impressive performances for Williams have attracted interest from the Swiss outfit, who are yet to finalize their 2025 lineup. Although Gabriel Bortoleto remains in contention to secure this seat, the Argentine's arrival is undoubtedly a game-changer. Having spent months deliberating on who they will select to drive alongside Nico Hülkenberg, Sauber find themselves with another candidate to assess. Of course, with Carlos Sainz agreeing to a multi-year deal at Williams, there is no space for Franco Colapinto in the team. However, the British outfit is committed to supporting him in contract negotiations with other teams. Speaking after the Baku GP, James Vowles made clear that he will support his driver in his efforts to find a 2025 seat. What I really hope is that he, Colapinto, is competing next season, he told elat.motorsport.com. I want a place for him so he can race in 2025, and ideally in Formula 1. In 2 races, he has shown to the world he deserves a place in Formula 1. I have always firmly believed that you have to give good drivers opportunities. So we'll see if we can find a way to work with Audi, Sauber, in this circumstance. That's what I was insinuating about regarding next year. At this stage, Sauber's priorities in terms of driver selection are unclear. For most of 2024, the Hinwil-based squad have shown a lack of decisiveness in this department. The arrival of Mattia Binotto as Chief Technical Officer in September, alongside other changes in senior management, have added another variable to their seemingly unsolved driver equation. For Franco Colapinto, the developments of the last few weeks could not have gone better. Not only has he been given a golden opportunity, but the Williams driver has seized it with both hands. It remains to be seen if CALOPINTO has a decisive edge over Gabriel Bortoleto or even Valtteri Bottas in Sauber's 2025 considerations. However, the 21-year-old is clearly becoming a central player in the final stages of this season's driver market evolutions. Alpine is in shambles and everyone can see that. The Enston-based team has been fighting the whole season against itself. The A524 project didn't improve as expected. Key figures have said their goodbyes. Even Esteban Ocon has decided to leave behind the pink and blue for a more stable white, joining Haas in 2025. But we must admit that Alpine is trying. In order to try to resurrect the team, Luca De Feo, CEO of Renault, decided to call back Flavio Briatore. The Italian manager is now the executive advisor, and he made some changes. After all, Briatore is not a stranger to Formula One or winning. But besides all the efforts, everything is uncertain for the French team, even their presence on the grid for upcoming seasons. One of Briatore's first moves since returning to Alpine was replacing Bruno Famin with a new team principal, Oliver Oakes. He's one of the youngest TPs on the grid alongside Christian Horner. According to the executive advisor, the old management wasn't what the team needed. Now Oakes seems to fit Briatore's standards. Young and full of passion, as he said. Speaking of a young addition to the team, there is also a new driver. After Ocon decided to leave, there were few candidates for his seat. From the paddock in Baku, Briatore revealed that they were trying to sign Carlos Sainz, but things didn't go as expected. So he looked inside his own box and signed Jack Doohan, already a reserve driver for the team. But there are still a few questions to answer. And in Baku, Alpine faced yet another problematic weekend. From FP1, Ocon and Gasly struggled in their cars. Ocon had to retire from FP1 due to a problem with his power unit and qualified in P20. On Sunday morning, Alpine communicated that the driver had to start from the pit lane after the team worked on his car under parc fermé conditions. On the other side of the box, Gasly should have started his race in P13, but he was disqualified after his car was found to have exceeded the instantaneous fuel mass flow. At the end, both cars finished their race outside the point zone, Gasly in P12 and Ocon in P15. Not the worst results, but things could have been better. But there are only 7 races left, and the French team has to resolve all their issues for the upcoming season. Will De Feo sell the team? Will they keep the Renault engine or will they become a client team? The only certain thing is that Alpine needs to figure out its own identity. That's it for today's video. I'll see you in the next one.